Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
Single dad ran toward danger to save a stranger's daughter. What happened after changed everything. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of the Brooks' modest suburban home, casting warm patches of light across the worn wooden table. David Brooks stood at the counter, carefully preparing 2 plates of scrambled eggs and toast. The familiar sound of his daughter's footsteps on the creaky stairs made him smile, even as worry tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Morning, Hannah," he said, turning to face his 14-year-old daughter. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore her favorite weekend outfit, faded jeans and an oversized sweater that had once belonged to her mother. "Hey, Dad." Hannah slid into her usual seat, her eyes fixed on her phone. David set a plate in front of her, along with a glass of orange juice. "I thought maybe we could head to the park today. Weather's nice." He tried to keep his voice light, casual, though his heart ached at the distance that had grown between them lately. Hannah looked up, her expression guarded. "Really? Don't you have work?" "Businesses." David paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's a bit slow right now, but that means we get to spend some time together, right?" The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft clink of forks against plates. David watched as Hannah pushed her eggs around, taking small bites between glances at her phone. The morning light caught the silver frame on the wall, a photo of the 3 of them from 5 years ago, before the accident that took his wife. "I miss when we used to do stuff together," Hannah said suddenly, her voice small. David's throat tightened. "I know things have been tough lately. I'm trying, Hannah. I really am." She nodded, finally setting her phone down. "Remember when Mom used to make those weird pancakes? The ones that were supposed to be animals but looked more like blobs?" A genuine laugh escaped David's lips. "And she'd insist they were perfect every time." "That's clearly an elephant, David." He mimicked his late wife's defensive tone, making Hannah smile. "She was terrible at pancake art," Hannah agreed, her eyes softening. "But they always tasted good." David reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. "She'd be so proud of you, you know, growing up so strong, so smart." Hannah squeezed back, and for a moment the strain between them felt lighter. They finished their breakfast in a more comfortable silence, the morning sun growing stronger outside. Later, as they walked down their tree-lined street toward the park, Hannah spoke again. "Dad, do you think Mom would like who we are now?" David took a deep breath, considering the question. "I think she'd love you exactly as you are." "Me? She'd probably tell me to stop working so much and learn to make better pancakes." Hannah laughed, a sound that reminded him so much of her mother it made his heart skip. "She always said you were hopeless in the kitchen." "Hey, I make decent scrambled eggs." "Yeah, because that's literally the only thing you can cook without burning." They walked on, their steps falling into sync. The park was visible now, its green expanse stretching out before them. Other families were already there, enjoying the weekend morning. "Mom loved this park," Hannah said softly. "Remember how she used to bring her sketchbook and draw the trees?" David nodded, the memory both sweet and painful. She'd sit for hours under that big oak tree, working on her art, said it was the perfect spot for inspiration. The conversation drifted into comfortable silence as they approached the park's entrance, both lost in their own memories of the woman they'd lost. The morning held a bittersweet quality now, tinged with both loss and love, but also with something that felt almost like hope. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The morning sun painted long shadows across the park's winding paths as David and Hannah walked side by side. Cherry blossoms dotted the ground like pink confetti, and the warm spring breeze carried the sweet scent of newly bloomed flowers. David glanced at his 14-year-old daughter, noticing how the sunlight caught her dark hair, so much like her mother's. "Remember when we used to come here every weekend?" Hannah asked, kicking a small stone along the path. "Back when I was little?" David nodded, his throat tightening slightly. "You loved the swings, couldn't get enough of them." "Mom would push me so high," Hannah said softly. "I always felt like I could touch the clouds." David's chest ached at the memory, but he managed a smile. "You were fearless back then. Nearly gave me a heart attack with some of those jumps." Hannah laughed, a sound that had become rare these days. "I wasn't that bad." "Oh, yes, you were." David chuckled, grateful for this moment of connection. The past few weeks had been tough, with Hannah growing more distant and his work slowing down. But here, in the familiar surroundings of their local park, things felt almost normal. They passed the playground, now filled with young children and their parents. The sound of laughter and excited squeals floated through the air. An ice cream vendor pushed his cart along the path, the cheerful jingle of his bell mixing with the children's voices. "Want some ice cream?" David asked, reaching for his wallet. Hannah shook her head. "Maybe later. Can we just walk for a while?" "Of course." David tucked his wallet away, touched by her desire to simply spend time together. They followed the path as it curved around the duck pond, where a family was feeding the birds. A little girl in a yellow dress threw breadcrumbs while her parents watched, holding hands. David felt Hannah tense beside him, and he knew she was thinking of her mother again. As they approached the crosswalk at the edge of the park, David noticed a young girl with auburn hair. She couldn't have been more than 12, sitting on a bench alone, drawing in a notebook. Something about her solitary figure made his heart heavy. The walk signal turned green, and they stepped onto the crosswalk together. The peaceful morning shattered in an instant. A silver sedan came careening around the corner, its tires screeching against the pavement. The young girl from the bench jumped up in panic, her notebook falling forgotten to the ground. She darted into the street, directly into the path of an oncoming delivery truck. David's body moved before his mind could process what was happening. "Hannah, stay back!" he shouted, pushing his daughter toward the safety of the sidewalk. His feet pounded against the asphalt as he sprinted toward the girl, who stood frozen in terror, her eyes wide and fixed on the approaching truck. The truck driver blasted his horn, brakes squealing. David lunged forward, wrapping his arms around the girl's small frame. He twisted his body, throwing them both clear of the truck's path. They hit the ground hard, David taking the brunt of the impact on his right side. Pain shot through his leg and arm as they rolled across the rough pavement. For a moment, everything went quiet, except for the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then the world rushed back in. The screech of brakes, people shouting, Hannah's terrified voice calling, "Dad!" David's head spun as he lay on the rough asphalt. The world around him was a blur of motion and sound, his ears ringing from the screech of tires and the gasps of onlookers. His right arm and leg throbbed where he'd hit the ground, but the pain felt distant, secondary to the rush of adrenaline still coursing through his body. "Sophie! Sophie!" A woman's sharp voice cut through the chaos. "Oh my God, Sophie!" David blinked, trying to clear his vision. Hannah was at his side now, her face pale with worry. "Dad, are you okay?" She grabbed his hand, helping him sit up slowly. A few feet away, a well-dressed woman in her late 30s had wrapped her arms around the little girl David had pulled from the truck's path. The woman's designer suit was wrinkled, her carefully styled hair coming loose as she checked Sophie for injuries. "I'm fine, sweetheart," David assured Hannah, though his body protested as he got to his feet. He wobbled slightly, and Hannah steadied him with a firm grip on his elbow. Sophie, the little girl, was trembling. Her face was streaked with tears, and she clung to the woman, presumably her mother, with desperate intensity. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, with long brown hair now tangled from the incident. "Are you hurt anywhere?" the woman asked Sophie, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Can you move everything?" Her hands moved quickly over Sophie's arms and legs, checking for injuries. Sophie nodded, too shaken to speak. Her wide eyes darted between her mother and David, fear still evident in her expression. The woman, Sophie's mother, finally looked up at David. Her face was a mask of professional composure, though her hands still trembled slightly where they gripped Sophie's shoulders. "Thank you," she said, her tone clipped but sincere. That was very brave of you." "Anyone would have done the same," David replied, wincing as he shifted his weight. His leg was definitely going to bruise. "Mom," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "He saved me." The woman nodded, already pulling out her phone. "Yes, he did, sweetie, and we need to get you checked out at the hospital." She dialed quickly, then spoke into the phone. "Yes, I need a car at Harrison Park, immediately. There's been an accident." David watched as she efficiently took control of the situation, her movements precise despite the chaos of the moment. A small crowd had gathered, and someone mentioned that the police were on their way. The woman turned back to David, reaching into her purse with one hand while keeping the other firmly on Sophie's shoulder. She pulled out a business card. "I'm Catherine Miller. I can't thank you enough. If you have any medical expenses from this, please contact my office." Her words were formal, almost rehearsed, as if she were closing a business deal rather than addressing the man who had just saved her daughter's life. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and Catherine quickly guided Sophie toward it. At the last moment, Sophie looked back at David, her eyes full of something between gratitude and fear. "Thank you again," Catherine said over her shoulder, her voice already distant as she helped Sophie into the car. "The police will probably want to speak with you." David stood there, his arm around Hannah's shoulders, watching as the car pulled away from the curb. The whole incident had lasted less than 5 minutes, but somehow everything felt different. His heart was still racing, and the memory of Sophie's terrified face stayed with him as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. David eased himself onto his worn leather recliner, wincing as pain shot through his leg. The events from the park played over and over in his mind, like a movie stuck on repeat. He could still feel the rush of adrenaline, hear the screech of tires, and see the terrified look in that little girl's eyes. "Dad, do you want some ice for your leg?" Hannah stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. She'd been quiet since they got home, barely saying 2 words during dinner. "Thanks, sweetie, but I'm okay." David tried to smile, but his daughter's expression remained distant. "Want to watch something together?" Hannah shrugged. "I have homework." She turned away, then paused. "You could have gotten really hurt today, you know." "I couldn't just stand there and watch that truck hit her," David said softly. "But what about me?" Hannah's voice cracked slightly. "What if something had happened to you? Then I'd be all alone." David's heart sank. "Come here," he said, patting the arm of his chair. Hannah hesitated but walked over. "I'm sorry if I scared you, but I'm fine, just a few bruises." "That woman didn't even seem to care," Hannah muttered. "She barely looked at you." David rubbed his sore knee, remembering Catherine's brief thank you. It had felt rushed, almost dismissive. "Sometimes people react strangely in emergencies," he said, though the woman's coldness still bothered him. "Whatever." Hannah pulled away. I'm going to my room." David watched her go, feeling the familiar ache of failing his daughter somehow. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence broken only by Hannah's footsteps upstairs and the distant hum of traffic outside. He reached for the remote, hoping to distract himself, when his phone rang. An unknown number flashed on the screen. "Hello? Mr. Brooks?" A woman's clipped voice came through. "This is Catherine Miller, Sophie's mother. From the park today?" David sat up straighter, ignoring the twinge in his leg. "Yes, of course. How is Sophie?" "She's fine. Just some scrapes and bruises." Catherine's voice sounded strained. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. The doctors said it could have been much worse if you hadn't acted so quickly." "I'm just glad I was there," David said, waiting for more, but Catherine remained silent for a moment. "Yes, well..." She cleared her throat. "We've got everything under control now. The hospital took good care of her, and we'll handle the rest from here." David found himself gripping the phone tighter. "Of course. I hope she recovers quickly." "Thank you again, Mr. Brooks. Goodbye." The line went dead before David could respond. He stared at his phone, feeling oddly deflated. The little girl's face floated in his memory, her wide, frightened eyes, the way she'd clung to him for those brief moments before her mother arrived. Now it seemed he'd never know if she was truly okay. Upstairs, he heard Hannah's music start playing, the muffled bass beating like a distant heartbeat through the ceiling. David leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting between the terrified child he'd saved and his own daughter, who seemed to be slipping further away with each passing day. The evening settled around him, quiet and heavy with unspoken words. His leg throbbed, a physical reminder of a moment that already felt like a dream, a moment of pure instinct that had saved a life but seemed to have changed nothing else. David sat at his kitchen table the next morning, sipping coffee and reviewing work orders, when his phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number flashed across the screen. He answered with his usual professional tone. "David Brooks speaking." "Mr. Brooks?" Catherine's voice crackled through the speaker, tight with tension. "This is Catherine Wilson, Sophie's mother. From yesterday at the park?" "Yes, of course. How is Sophie doing?" David straightened in his chair, remembering the fear in the girl's eyes. "Not well, I'm afraid." Catherine's words tumbled out in a rush. She barely slept last night. Every time she hears a car outside, she starts shaking. She won't let me leave for work, and I have an important meeting in an hour that I absolutely cannot miss. David heard the strain in her voice, along with something else. Desperation. In the background, he could hear soft whimpering. "I know this is completely inappropriate to ask, but..." Catherine paused, taking a deep breath. "Would you be willing to watch Sophie for a few days? She seems to have formed some kind of connection with you after what happened. She keeps asking about the man who saved me." David's coffee grew cold as he listened to Catherine explain her situation. Major client meetings, deadlines, presentations she couldn't reschedule. His eyes drifted to the family photo on his wall. Him, Hannah, and his late wife, Sarah, at the beach. Hannah would be home from school soon, and things were already tense between them. "Mr. Brooks?" Catherine's voice pulled him back. "I know it's a lot to ask. I can pay you, of course." "It's not about money," David said quietly. "I have my own daughter to consider, and my work schedule—" "Please," Catherine interrupted. "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. Sophie refuses to go to her usual sitter, and I don't have anyone else." David rubbed his temples, thinking of his own packed schedule of repair jobs. But he also couldn't shake the image of that terrified little girl from yesterday. "Let me make a few calls," he said finally. "I might be able to move some appointments around." "Oh, thank goodness," Catherine breathed. "Just for the weekend. I promise I'll figure something else out by Monday." They spent the next few minutes working out the details. Catherine would drop Sophie off that afternoon with clothes and supplies. David gave her his address and basic information about his home setup. "Mr. Brooks?" Catherine's voice had softened slightly. "Thank you. I know this is unusual, but I truly appreciate it." After hanging up, David sat in his quiet kitchen, wondering if he'd made the right decision. He'd need to explain this to Hannah, who was already feeling neglected. His weekend plans of catching up on work would have to be adjusted. He picked up his phone again, dialing his most understanding clients to reschedule their repairs. As he made the calls, he couldn't help but think about Sophie's fear. He remembered Hannah's nightmares after losing her mother, how she'd needed extra comfort and patience. Maybe that experience would help him now. The last call ended, and David stood up to prepare the spare room. Hannah wouldn't be happy about this arrangement, but perhaps having another child in the house might help break down some of the walls that had built up between them. Or maybe it would make things worse. Either way, he'd made his decision. For the next few days, his home would shelter one more wounded heart. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across David's front porch as Catherine's sleek black car pulled into the driveway. Sophie stepped out slowly, clutching a worn blue duffel bag to her chest, like a shield. Her small frame seemed to shrink even more as she walked toward the house, her eyes fixed on the ground. David's heart ached at the sight. He remembered how his own daughter had looked just as lost in the days following her mother's death. "Welcome, Sophie," he said softly, trying to keep his voice warm and gentle. "Come on in." Hannah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. David could feel the tension radiating from his daughter, but he chose to focus on Sophie for now. Catherine barely got out of her car, merely waving from the driver's seat before backing out of the driveway. Sophie's shoulders slumped even more as she watched her mother leave. Inside the house, David showed Sophie to the guest room. "I know it's not much," he said, gesturing to the simple space with its twin bed and plain cream walls. "But we can make it more comfortable if you'd like." Sophie just nodded, still clutching her bag. Her knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly. "The bathroom's right across the hall," David continued, pointing, "and my room is just down there if you need anything during the night." He paused, unsure what else to say. "Would you like help unpacking?" Sophie shook her head quickly, taking a small step back. "That's fine," David assured her. "Take your time. We usually eat dinner around 6, but there's no pressure. You can come down whenever you're ready." In the kitchen, Hannah was aggressively chopping vegetables for dinner. The sharp sounds of the knife hitting the cutting board echoed through the house. "Hannah," David said quietly, "could you try to be a little more welcoming?" "Why?" Hannah didn't look up from her chopping. "It's not like she wants to be here anyway." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's been through a lot, sweetie. Remember how hard it was for us when—" He trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. Hannah's chopping slowed slightly. "Fine," she muttered. "But I'm not sharing my bathroom." As David prepared dinner, his signature spaghetti and meatballs, he kept glancing toward the stairs, hoping to see Sophie emerge. The smell of garlic and tomatoes filled the house, but there was no sign of movement from upstairs. When the food was ready, David called up the stairs. "Sophie, dinner's ready if you'd like to join us." After a long moment, soft footsteps descended the stairs. Sophie appeared, looking even smaller in the oversized sweater she'd changed into. She hovered uncertainly at the edge of the kitchen. "Would you like to sit with us?" David gestured to the table where Hannah was already slouched in her usual chair. Sophie shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "That's okay," David said, trying to hide his disappointment. He filled a plate and set it on the coffee table in the living room. "You can eat here if you're more comfortable. There's plenty more if you want seconds." Sophie moved silently to the couch, perching on the edge like a bird ready to take flight. She didn't touch the food, just stared at it while David and Hannah ate in awkward silence at the kitchen table. David felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He watched Sophie's untouched plate and wondered if he'd made the right decision in agreeing to take her in. But when he remembered her face in the moments after the accident, that look of pure terror and vulnerability, he knew he couldn't have said no. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as David flipped pancakes on the griddle. The sweet smell of butter and maple syrup filled the air, but the atmosphere remained tense. Sophie sat curled up on the living room couch, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring blankly at the wall. David placed 3 plates of steaming pancakes on the kitchen table. "Breakfast is ready," he called out, trying to keep his voice cheerful. Hannah dragged herself to the table, her eyes heavy with sleep, while Sophie didn't move an inch. "Sophie?" David walked over to the couch. "I made chocolate chip pancakes. They're still warm." Sophie shook her head slightly, her dark hair falling over her face like a curtain. David ran his hand through his hair, feeling the frustration building in his chest. "How about we go to the park later? It's a beautiful day and I hate the park." Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper, but the words carried a sharp edge. "I don't want to go anywhere." David stood there, at a loss for words. He'd dealt with Hannah's mood swings before, but this was different. Sophie's pain felt like a physical barrier between them, and he had no idea how to break through it. "That's okay," he said finally. "We can stay home, maybe watch a movie or—" Sophie turned away, pressing herself further into the corner of the couch. David's shoulders slumped as he returned to the kitchen, where Hannah was picking at her pancakes. "She needs to eat something," Hannah muttered, stabbing a piece of pancake with more force than necessary. David nodded, pushing his own plate away. "I know, sweetie, I'm trying." Hannah got up from the table, her chair scraping against the floor. She approached Sophie with determined steps, and David watched anxiously. "Hey," Hannah said, settling on the opposite end of the couch. "You know, these pancakes are actually pretty good. Dad doesn't cook much, but when he does pancakes, they're not half bad." Sophie remained silent, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. "I have some books in my room if you want to read," Hannah tried again. "Or we could play a game or something." Still no response. Hannah's face fell, and she shot an accusatory look at her father. "Whatever," she muttered, standing up. "I'm going to my room." David followed Hannah into the hallway. "Hannah, wait!" She whirled around, her eyes blazing. "You didn't even notice, did you?" she hissed. "You've been so busy trying to get her to talk that you barely said 2 words to me all morning." David felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "That's not true, But the words died in his throat as he realized she was right. He'd been so focused on Sophie that he'd completely overlooked his own daughter. "I get it, okay?" Hannah's voice cracked slightly. "She needs help. But I'm your daughter, Dad. I'm right here, and sometimes I need you too." Before David could respond, Hannah disappeared into her room, the door closing with a quiet but definitive click. He stood in the hallway, caught between 2 closed-off girls, feeling more inadequate than ever. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders as he realized he had no idea how to help either of them. David sat on the worn leather couch in his living room, watching Sophie curl up in the armchair across from him. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across her small frame. She hadn't said more than a few words since arriving, but something in her posture seemed different today. "I keep seeing it," Sophie whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible. "The truck coming at me." David leaned forward slightly, careful not to move too quickly. "That must be really scary," he said softly. Sophie nodded, pulling her knees closer to her chest. "Every time I hear a car now, my heart starts racing." Her fingers twisted the hem of her sweater. "Mom doesn't understand. She says I need to get over it." "There's no timeline for feeling better after something scary happens," David said, thinking carefully about his words. "When I lost my wife, Hannah's mom, it took me a long time to feel okay again. Sometimes it still hurts." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "What happened to her?" "She was in a car accident," David said quietly. "It was 5 years ago." "Is that why you helped me?" Sophie asked, her voice stronger now. "Because of what happened to her?" David shook his head. "I helped you because it was the right thing to do. But maybe understanding what it feels like to be scared helped me move faster that day." From the kitchen doorway, Hannah stood silently watching. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but hearing her dad talk about Mom made her pause. Sophie uncurled slightly from her tight position. "I used to love going to the park," she admitted, "but now all I can think about is cars and people and—" Her voice trembled. "That's okay," David assured her. "We don't have to go anywhere you don't feel safe. Maybe we can find things to do right here until you're ready." "Like what?" Sophie asked, a hint of interest in her voice. "Well, I noticed you brought some art supplies in your bag," David said. "I'm terrible at drawing, but Hannah's pretty good at it. Maybe we could all try something together?" Hannah felt her chest tighten at the mention of her name. She'd been so angry at her dad for focusing on Sophie, but watching him now, she saw something different. He wasn't trying to replace her. He was trying to help someone who was hurting, just like they had hurt after Mom died. Sophie glanced toward the kitchen, catching sight of Hannah. Instead of turning away, she offered a small smile. "Would you really draw with me?" she asked hesitantly. Hannah stepped into the living room, feeling her dad's surprised but hopeful gaze. "Sure," she said, managing a genuine smile. "I could show you how to draw dogs. That's what I started with when—" She paused, then continued. "When I needed something to make me feel better." David watched his daughter move closer to Sophie's chair, his heart swelling with pride and relief. Sophie's shoulders relaxed slightly as Hannah sat on the arm of the couch, and for the first time since the accident, the tension in the room began to ease. The morning light grew warmer, filling the room with a gentle glow as Sophie started talking about her favorite animals to draw. David stayed quiet, witnessing the small but significant moment of connection between the two girls. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a tiny crack in the walls that had seemed so insurmountable just hours before. The sharp rap of knuckles against the front door made David jump. He was in the middle of making lunch, grilled cheese sandwiches, Sophie's newfound favorite. Setting down the spatula, he wiped his hands on a dish towel and headed for the door. Catherine stood on his porch, her business suit pristine, and her face set in hard lines. "Where's my daughter?" she demanded, stepping past David without waiting for an invitation. "She's in the backyard with Hannah," David said, closing the door. The smell of slightly burning cheese made him hurry back to the kitchen. "They're drawing together." Catherine followed him, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "This has gone on long enough. It's been 5 days. I appreciate what you did for Sophie, but she needs to come home now." David flipped the sandwich just in time to save it from burning. "Sophie's been making progress here," he said carefully. "She's starting to open up." "She's my daughter," Catherine cut in. "And you're a stranger. This arrangement was temporary." She pulled her purse forward and retrieved her checkbook. I'll compensate you for your time, of course. The back door squeaked open, and Sophie's laughter drifted in. David hadn't heard that sound before today. Money isn't the issue, he said quietly. Sophie, Catherine called out. Come here, please, we're leaving. The laughter stopped. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her face falling when she saw her mother. Hannah stood behind her, looking uncertain. I don't want to go, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Catherine's expression hardened. This isn't up for discussion. Get your things. But Mom. Now, Sophie. David turned off the stove and stepped between them. Maybe we could talk about this, he suggested. Sophie's been doing really well here. Yesterday, she even walked to the corner store with us. Catherine's eyes flashed. I don't need parenting advice from you, Mr. Brooks. She pulled out her checkbook again. How much would you consider fair for your time? Sophie's lower lip trembled. Mom, please, I like it here. David helps me feel safe, and Hannah... That's enough, Catherine's voice cracked like a whip. We're going home. This isn't a debate. David watched Sophie shrink into herself, all the progress of the past few days evaporating. His chest tightened. Catherine, please, just listen to her for a moment. I've heard enough. Catherine scribbled on her checkbook, tore out the check, and thrust it at David. Thank you for your help, but we won't be needing it anymore. Sophie's eyes welled with tears. She looked at David pleadingly, then at Hannah, who seemed frozen in place. I won't go, Sophie said, her voice stronger now. You're never home anyway. You don't understand. Sophie Elizabeth, get your things right now. Catherine's tone left no room for argument. David saw the familiar signs of Sophie withdrawing, her shoulders hunching, her eyes dropping to the floor. All the trust they'd built, all the tiny steps toward healing, were crumbling before his eyes. Please, Sophie whispered. But Catherine had already grabbed her arm and was steering her toward the stairs. David stood helplessly in his kitchen, the check still untouched on the counter, watching as Sophie's world collapsed again. Hannah moved closer to him, slipping her hand into his. Can't you do something, Dad? She whispered. But David could only watch as Catherine marched Sophie upstairs to pack, knowing that his desire to help was colliding head-on with Catherine's parental rights and her complete blindness to her daughter's emotional needs. Sophie's face crumpled as Catherine's words hung in the air. Her small hands balled into fists, and her whole body began to shake. No, she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. I won't go back! Before anyone could react, Sophie bolted towards the back door, throwing it open with surprising force. The screen door slammed against the house as she ran into the backyard, her feet pounding against the grass. Sophie! David called out, his heart racing. He shot Catherine a frustrated look before limping after Sophie, his injured leg protesting with each step. Hannah stood frozen in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Sophie darted through the gate that led to the alley behind their house. David picked up his pace, ignoring the pain shooting through his leg. Sophie, please stop, he called out. It's not safe. The young girl's sobs echoed off the wooden fences lining the alley. She stumbled, falling to her knees on the rough pavement. David caught up to her, kneeling beside her despite the sharp pain in his leg. I can't go back, Sophie choked out between sobs. Please don't make me go back. David gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Let's go back to the house and talk about this, okay? You're safe here. Sophie's whole body trembled as she nodded. David helped her up, and they walked slowly back to the house. Catherine stood in the kitchen, her face a mask of confusion and frustration. Hannah had disappeared upstairs, clearly wanting to avoid the tension. Sophie, Catherine started, but David held up his hand. "Give us a minute," he said firmly. He led Sophie to the living room couch, where she curled up in the corner, making herself as small as possible. David sat next to her, keeping a respectful distance. "She doesn't love me," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mom's never there. She's always working or on her phone or—" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "She doesn't even look at me anymore." David's heart ached. He recognized the pain in her voice. It was the same pain he'd heard in Hannah's voice during their worst moments after her mother died. "Sometimes," Sophie continued, her words tumbling out, "I sit in my room all night, and she doesn't even check on me. When I try to talk to her, she says she's busy. She doesn't care about my drawings or my stories or—" Her voice broke. "She doesn't care about me." David moved closer, offering his presence as comfort. "That must hurt a lot," he said softly. Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "But here, you listened to me. You asked me about my day. You made me pancakes this morning." She looked up at him, her eyes full of pain and hope. "Why can't she be like that?" David took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups forget what's really important. They get caught up in work and forget to show their love." He glanced toward the kitchen where Catherine stood, hoping she could hear their conversation. "But that doesn't mean they don't love you." "I'm scared all the time," Sophie admitted. "The accident made it worse, but I was scared before too. Scared of being alone, scared she'll forget about me completely." David gently put his arm around her shoulders. "You're not alone, Sophie. Not anymore. Whether you're here or at home, you'll always have people who care about you. I promise." Sophie leaned into his embrace, her tears soaking into his shirt. For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of her pain filling the room. David sat at his kitchen table, phone pressed to his ear, listening to Catherine's cold, businesslike voice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the worn wooden surface as she laid out her proposition. "I understand this is an unusual situation," Catherine said, her words clipped and precise. "But I'm willing to compensate you fairly for your time. Name your price." David's stomach twisted. He glanced toward the living room where Sophie was curled up on the couch, sketching in her notebook. The girl had finally started to smile again, though her eyes still held shadows of fear. "Mrs. Roberts," he began, keeping his voice low, "this isn't about money." "Everything is about money, Mr. Brooks," Catherine cut in. "Let's be practical here. You're a single father running a struggling handyman business. I'm offering you a solution that benefits us both." A floorboard creaked behind him. David turned to find Sophie standing in the doorway, her face pale, her sketchbook clutched tightly against her chest. Her lower lip trembled as she stared at him, and he knew she'd heard every word. "Is she trying to pay you to keep me?" Sophie's voice cracked. Like I'm something she can just buy off?" "Sophie, honey." David started to rise from his chair, but Sophie backed away. "I knew it," she cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She doesn't want me. She never wanted me." Through the phone, Catherine's voice grew sharp. "Is that Sophie? Let me speak to her." Sophie shook her head violently, backing further away. "I won't go back. You can't make me." David covered the phone's microphone. "Sophie, please." But Sophie had already turned and fled, her footsteps thundering up the stairs. A door slammed somewhere above, and David's heart sank. "Mr. Brooks?" Catherine's voice crackled through the phone. "What's happening?" David pressed his fingers to his temples, feeling a headache building. "Mrs. Roberts, your daughter just overheard you trying to buy her care. She's upset." "Well, that's precisely why she needs structure and discipline," Catherine replied. This emotional behavior is exactly what I'm talking about. I simply don't have time to deal with these outbursts. David's free hand clenched into a fist. He thought about his own daughter, Hannah, and how he'd moved heaven and earth to be there for her after her mother died. The idea of treating a child's pain as an inconvenience made his blood boil. $2,000 a month, Catherine continued, as if discussing a business contract. Plus expenses. That should be more than fair. David looked at his stack of unpaid bills on the counter. The money would solve so many problems. His business was struggling, and Hannah needed new school supplies. It would be the practical choice, the sensible choice. But then he thought about Sophie's face when she'd heard her mother trying to pay someone else to care for her. He thought about the trust he'd slowly built with her, the way she'd finally started to open up. How could he turn this into a transaction? "I'll keep Sophie with me," he said finally, his voice firm. "But not for money. She needs stability and care right now, not to feel like she's being handed off to the highest bidder." "Mr. Brooks," Catherine's tone grew icy. "Don't be foolish, everyone has a price." "Not for this," David replied. "Not for her." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long and taut. David knew he was probably making a mistake, knew this could complicate everything. But somewhere upstairs, a little girl was crying, believing herself unwanted, and that, more than anything, made his decision clear. David stared at the pile of unopened bills on his kitchen counter. 3 canceled handyman jobs this week alone. His clients were understanding when he explained about Sophie, but understanding didn't pay the mortgage. He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the clock. 2 p.m., and he still hadn't touched any work. From the living room, he could hear Sophie's quiet sniffles. She hadn't left the house in 3 days, not even to sit in the backyard. The accident had left deeper scars than anyone realized. Yesterday, when he'd suggested a short walk to the mailbox, she'd curled into a ball on the couch and wouldn't speak for hours. "Sophie?" he called out softly. "Would you like some lunch?" No answer, just more sniffles. David's shoulders slumped as he walked to the living room. Sophie sat huddled in the corner of the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her eyes were red and puffy. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I'm being difficult." "Hey, no." David sat on the coffee table across from her. "You're not being difficult. You're dealing with something scary." "But your work." She glanced at his phone, which had buzzed twice already with messages from potential clients. David forced a smile. Work can wait. But it couldn't, not really. His savings were dwindling, and Hannah needed new school supplies. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders until he felt like he could barely breathe. Hannah came home from school, slamming the front door harder than necessary. She dropped her backpack in the hallway and headed straight for her room without a word. "Hannah," David called after her. "Could you come here for a minute?" "I have homework," she replied flatly. David looked between Sophie on the couch and the closed door of Hannah's room. His chest ached. When had everything become so complicated? "I'll be right back," he told Sophie, squeezing her shoulder gently. He knocked on Hannah's door. "Can we talk?" A long pause, then, "Whatever?" David found Hannah sitting cross-legged on her bed, pretending to read a textbook. He sat on the edge of her bed, his heart heavy. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Hannah's shoulders tensed, but she didn't look up. "I haven't been there for you lately. I've been so focused on helping Sophie that I forgot to check in with you. That's not okay." Hannah's lower lip trembled. "You forgot about movie night," she whispered. "We always watch movies on Thursday nights." David's heart sank. She was right. Their weekly tradition had completely slipped his mind. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I messed up. It's like, Hannah's voice cracked. It's like you don't even see me anymore. Like Sophie's more important. No, never. David moved closer, relieved when Hannah didn't pull away. You're my daughter. Nothing is more important than you. Then why does it feel like I'm invisible? David pulled Hannah into a hug, and she buried her face in his shoulder like she used to when she was little. I promise I'll do better, he whispered. We'll figure this out together, okay? Neither of them noticed Sophie standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face as she watched father and daughter reconnect. She wrapped her arms around herself, guilt gnawing at her heart. Silently, she backed away from the door, leaving them to their private moment. David stood at the kitchen counter, mechanically going through the motions of making dinner. His thoughts were scattered between Sophie's latest emotional breakdown and the pile of work orders he'd been neglecting. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Hannah stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pinched with emotion, and David recognized the look. It was the same expression she wore when she was trying not to cry. "Dad," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Can we talk?" David put down the knife he'd been using to chop vegetables. "Of course, sweetie. What's wrong?" Hannah's lower lip trembled. "Everything," she burst out. "Everything's wrong. Ever since Sophie came, it's like I don't exist anymore." The words hit David like a physical blow. He took a step toward her, but Hannah backed away. "You're always asking if Sophie's okay, if Sophie needs anything, if Sophie's eaten enough," Hannah continued, her voice rising. "But what about me, Dad? When was the last time you asked how I was doing, or helped me with my homework, or just sat with me?" David's chest tightened. The truth in Hannah's words stung, and he felt a wave of shame wash over him. He'd been so focused on helping Sophie that he'd forgotten his own daughter needed him too. "Last night, you missed my drama club performance," Hannah said quietly, tears now rolling down her cheeks. "You promised you'd be there, but you were busy helping Sophie with her nightmares again." "Oh, Hannah," David breathed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm so sorry. I completely forgot about the performance." "That's just it, Dad. You keep forgetting about me." Hannah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know Sophie needs help, but I need you too." David felt his own eyes growing wet. He remembered the promise he'd made to himself after his wife died, that he would always be there for Hannah, that she would never feel alone. Yet here she was, hurting because of his negligence. "Come here," he said softly, opening his arms. This time Hannah didn't back away. She walked into his embrace, burying her face in his shirt like she used to do when she was little. David held her tight, feeling her shoulders shake with quiet sobs. "I've really messed up, haven't I?" he murmured into her hair. "I got so caught up in helping Sophie that I forgot the most important person in my life." Hannah sniffled against his shirt. "I feel awful even saying anything," she admitted. "Sophie's been through so much." "No," David said firmly, pulling back to look at his daughter's face. "You have every right to feel this way. You're my daughter, Hannah. You will always, always come first." "But what about Sophie?" David wiped a tear from Hannah's cheek with his thumb. "We can help Sophie without me neglecting you. I promise I'll do better at balancing everything, starting now." Hannah looked up at him hopefully. "Really?" "Really," David nodded. "How about we start with dinner? Just you and me? We can order pizza and you can tell me all about the drama club performance I missed. And tomorrow, I promise I'll be there to help you with your history project." A small smile appeared on Hannah's face. "Could we maybe watch a movie too?" "Absolutely," David said, pulling her close again. Whatever you want, sweetheart. I'm so sorry I made you feel forgotten. That's never going to happen again. Hannah's arms tightened around him. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Hannah. More than anything in this world. Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her sketchbook open in front of her. David watched as she drew careful lines across the page, her shoulders hunched forward. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting warm patches of light around them. I used to like school, Sophie said quietly, not looking up from her drawing. Her pencil moved in slow, deliberate strokes. But then things changed. David settled into the armchair nearby, giving her space while staying close enough to listen. What changed? Sophie's hand trembled slightly as she added details to her sketch. The other kids? They started making fun of me because I didn't have nice clothes like them. Mom was always too busy to take me shopping. Her voice quivered. They called me charity case and wouldn't let me sit with them at lunch. David's heart ached. He remembered Hannah coming home in tears once after similar treatment. That must have been really hard. Mom said I needed to toughen up. Sophie's pencil stopped moving. She told me I was being too sensitive. A tear splashed onto her drawing, creating a dark spot on the paper. I tried to tell her how much it hurt, but she was always on her phone or rushing to meetings. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Sometimes grown-ups don't understand how much their words can hurt. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I just wanted her to listen. To see me. She looked up at David, her eyes swimming with tears. The day of the accident, I was running away because Tommy Jenkins told everyone my mom didn't want me. That's why she's never around. Oh, Sophie. David's voice was gentle. And you know what's worse? Sophie's lower lip trembled. Sometimes I think maybe Tommy was right. Maybe Mom really doesn't want me. David moved from the chair to sit beside her on the floor. Can I tell you something? He waited until Sophie nodded. Sometimes people, even parents, struggle to show love the way they should. But that doesn't mean you're not worthy of being loved. Sophie's shoulders shook as she tried to hold back sobs. But what if she never learns to love me right? What if nobody ever does? David felt his own eyes growing wet. Listen to me, Sophie. You are not alone. Not anymore. He gestured to her drawing, a sketch of their backyard with Hannah reading under the old oak tree. Look at what you created here. You're part of this home now, even if it's just for a while. You matter to us. Sophie's tears fell freely now. Really? Really? David reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But instead, Sophie leaned into his side, her small frame shaking with quiet sobs. I'm scared, she whispered against his shoulder. I know, David said softly, putting an arm around her. And that's okay. Being scared doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. They sat there in the afternoon light, Sophie's sketchbook forgotten on the floor. David felt something shift in his heart, a protective instinct he'd only ever felt before with Hannah. This wasn't just about helping a stranger's child anymore. This was about being there for a little girl who needed someone to see her, to hear her, to care. Sophie's breathing eventually steadied, but she didn't pull away. Thank you, she murmured, her voice small but steady. For what? For listening. For making me feel safe. The doorbell rang just as David was helping Sophie with her math homework. The sharp sound made Sophie jump, her pencil clattering to the floor. David gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before heading to answer the door. Catherine stood on the doorstep, her business suit perfectly pressed and her face tight with anger. Where is my daughter? She demanded, pushing past David into the house. "Catherine, I wasn't expecting you," David said, keeping his voice calm despite the tension building in his chest. "Sophie's doing her homework right now." "This has gone on long enough," Catherine snapped, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she marched toward the kitchen. "You've completely overstepped your boundaries. You were supposed to watch her for a few days, not become her substitute father." Sophie looked up from her textbook, her face going pale at the sight of her mother. Hannah, who had been helping Sophie with a particularly difficult problem, instinctively moved closer to the younger girl. "Mom, please," Sophie whispered, shrinking in her chair. "Get your things," Catherine ordered. "We're leaving, now." David stepped between Catherine and Sophie. "Hold on a minute. Sophie's been making real progress here. She's starting to open up, to feel safe again. Maybe we should talk about this first." Catherine's eyes flashed. "Talk about what? You're a stranger who helped her one time. That doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my daughter's well-being." "I'm not trying to make decisions," David said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I'm just trying to help her heal. She needs stability right now and—" "Stability?" Catherine laughed sharply. "From a handyman? What could you possibly know about what my daughter needs?" Tears started rolling down Sophie's cheeks. "I don't want to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't make me go." Catherine spun toward her daughter. "Sophie, stop being difficult. This isn't your decision to make." "Why not?" Sophie's voice grew stronger, though it shook with emotion. "You're never there anyway. You're always working, always gone, and when you are home, you barely talk to me." "That's enough." Catherine's composure cracked. "I'm doing my best. Do you think it's easy raising you alone? Your father—" She stopped abruptly, her face flushing. "What about Dad?" Sophie demanded. "You said he was away on business, but that was months ago. Why hasn't he called? Why won't you tell me where he is?" The room fell silent. Catherine's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, David saw the exhaustion behind her anger. "I don't know where he is," she admitted quietly. "He's been unreachable for months. His phone is disconnected, his email doesn't work. I've tried everything." Sophie's face crumpled. "He left? He left us?" David's heart ached as he watched Sophie process this revelation. He wanted to comfort her, but he knew this moment belonged to her and Catherine. "I don't want to go home," Sophie said through her tears. "I feel safe here. David listens to me. Hannah's like the sister I never had. Please, Mom, please don't make me leave." Catherine stood frozen, her carefully maintained facade cracking further with each word from her daughter. The tension in the room was palpable as David waited to see what she would do next, knowing his next actions could either help or hurt this fragile situation. The slam of the front door echoed through the house. David's heart dropped as he watched Sophie disappear into the gathering dusk, her small figure darting down the street. "Sophie," he called out, his voice cracking with worry. He turned to Catherine, who stood frozen in the doorway. "This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. She's not ready." Hannah appeared at his side, her face tight with concern. "Dad, we need to find her. It's getting dark." David nodded, grabbing his jacket from the hook by the door. "Catherine, you stay here in case she comes back. Hannah, you take the route to the school. I'll check the park." For once, Hannah didn't argue or roll her eyes. Instead, she grabbed her phone and rushed out the door, calling Sophie's name. David felt a surge of pride through his worry. His daughter was showing more maturity than he'd given her credit for. The evening air was cool as David jogged down the sidewalk, his leg still aching from the accident. Every shadow made him pause. Every rustle of leaves caught his attention. "Sophie," he called out repeatedly, ignoring the curious looks from neighbors. His phone buzzed, a text from Hannah. Not at school. Checking the playground. David picked up his pace, heading toward the park where he'd first saved Sophie. His chest tightened as he remembered that day, how frightened she'd looked then, just like now. The park was mostly empty, the swings moving gently in the breeze. David scanned the area, his eyes adjusting to the dimming light. That's when he heard it, a small sniffle coming from behind the big oak tree near the pond. "Hannah," he texted quickly. "Park by the oak tree." He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Sophie?" he called softly. "It's just me." A quiet sob answered him. As he rounded the tree, he found Sophie huddled against the trunk, her knees pulled up to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please don't make me go." David knelt beside her, ignoring the twinge in his injured leg. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently. "You really scared us." Hannah appeared then, slightly out of breath from running. She didn't say anything, just sat down on Sophie's other side, creating a protective circle around the younger girl. "I know my mom doesn't really want me," Sophie said, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "She just feels like she has to take care of me because she's my mom. But she doesn't see me. Not like you do." David's heart ached at her words. He reached out and took her small hand in his. "Listen to me, Sophie. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to. We'll figure something out, okay?" Hannah touched Sophie's shoulder. "Yeah, and besides, who else is going to help me convince Dad to get a dog?" A tiny smile appeared on Sophie's tear-stained face. David squeezed her hand gently. "I promise you, right here and now, that you don't have to leave until you're ready. We'll talk to your mom and work something out." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes still wet but now filled with hope. "Really?" "Really," David assured her. "Now, what do you say we head home? It's getting chilly out here." Sophie nodded, allowing David and Hannah to help her to her feet. As they walked back together, Sophie between them, David noticed Hannah slip her hand into Sophie's, a small gesture that said more than words ever could. David sat on the worn leather couch in his living room, his body aching from the long search for Sophie. The young girl curled up in the armchair across from him, her eyes red from crying. The room was quiet, except for the gentle ticking of the old wall clock and the distant sound of Hannah making hot chocolate in the kitchen. "You know," David began softly, his hands clasped together, "when I lost my wife, Hannah's mom, I felt like running away too." He watched as Sophie's eyes lifted to meet his. "Sometimes the pain feels too big to handle." Sophie pulled her knees closer to her chest. "What happened to her?" David took a deep breath, the familiar ache in his chest returning. "Car accident, 5 years ago. I was supposed to pick her up that day, but I got caught up with work." His voice cracked slightly. "For the longest time I blamed myself. I thought if I had just been there." "That's how I feel about my dad," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "He left 6 months ago. Mom said he needed time to think, but he never came back." She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Sometimes I think it's my fault. Maybe if I had been a better daughter." "Sophie," David said firmly but gently, "it's not your fault. Just like what happened to my wife wasn't my fault. Sometimes people leave, and it hurts more than anything. But it's not because of us." Hannah appeared with 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, setting them on the coffee table. She sat next to her father, their shoulders touching. "I miss having someone who really sees me," Sophie admitted, reaching for her mug. "Mom's always working or on her phone. It's like I'm invisible." David nodded, understanding flooding his features. "After we lost Sarah, that was my wife's name, I threw myself into work too. I thought if I stayed busy enough, the pain would go away." He glanced at Hannah. "But all I did was push away the one person who needed me most." Hannah leaned against her father's shoulder. "We got through it together, though," she said, offering Sophie a small smile. "That's what family does," David added. "We help each other heal, even when it's hard, even when we're scared." Sophie took a sip of her hot chocolate, her hands steadying. "I feel safe here," she admitted. "With both of you. I haven't felt safe in a long time." The phone rang, breaking the moment. David checked the caller ID. It was Catherine. He answered, preparing himself for another confrontation, but her voice was different this time. "David," Catherine said, her usual sharp tone replaced with something softer, more vulnerable. "I'm sorry for how I acted earlier. I've been handling everything wrong." David watched Sophie, who was now engaged in quiet conversation with Hannah. "We all make mistakes," he replied gently. "She's different with you," Catherine continued. "Calmer, happier. I can't remember the last time I saw her smile before she started staying with you." There was a pause. "Thank you for giving her what I couldn't." As David ended the call, he looked at Sophie again. The terrified girl who had arrived at his doorstep was slowly being replaced by someone stronger, someone healing. In helping her find peace, he realized, he had found some of his own. Catherine stood in David's living room, her normally confident posture slightly slumped. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. She watched as Sophie sat close to Hannah on the couch, the two girls sharing a quiet moment over a book. "I've been so blind," Catherine said softly, her voice catching. She turned to David, who leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "I kept thinking that if I could just provide for her, give her everything she needed materially." She shook her head, brushing away an unexpected tear. David uncrossed his arms, his expression softening. "Sometimes what kids need most isn't stuff," he said gently. "Sometimes they just need us to be there." "I see that now," Catherine admitted. She watched Sophie laugh at something Hannah had said, the sound making her heart ache. "When did you last hear her laugh like that at home?" she asked herself aloud. The question hung in the air between them. David remained quiet, letting Catherine work through her thoughts. "I've been so focused on my career, on being successful," Catherine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing it all for her, but really—" She paused, swallowing hard. "I was doing it to prove something to myself, and in the process, I lost sight of what Sophie really needed." David shifted his weight, wincing slightly at the lingering pain in his leg from the accident. "It's not too late," he offered. "Sophie needs you. She's always needed you." Catherine nodded, wiping away another tear. "The way she is with you and Hannah, it's like seeing a different child. She's opening up, healing." She turned to face David fully. "You've given her something I couldn't, a safe place to be herself." "Mom?" Sophie's voice came from behind them. Both adults turned to see her standing there, Hannah beside her, their hands linked in a show of support. Catherine took a tentative step toward her daughter. "Sophie, honey, I'm so sorry. I know I haven't been the mother you needed me to be." Sophie's grip on Hannah's hand tightened. "You're always so busy," she said quietly. "And when you're home, you're still working." "I know," Catherine acknowledged, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to do better. I want to be there for you. Really there." She knelt down to Sophie's level. "Would you be willing to give me another chance?" Sophie looked uncertainly between her mother and David. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "You don't have to cut ties," Catherine assured her quickly. "In fact," she glanced at David, "if it's all right with David and Hannah, maybe we could work something out. You could visit regularly." David nodded. Our door is always open. Sophie's face brightened slightly. Really? I could still see Hannah and David? Of course, Catherine said. I see now how important they've become to you, and… She took a deep breath. I see how much healing you've done here. I don't want to take that away from you. Sophie looked at her mother for a long moment, then at Hannah and David. If I can still come visit, then maybe… She took a small step toward Catherine. Maybe I could try coming home. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she managed a smile. We'll make it work, sweetheart. I promise. The morning sun streamed through David's kitchen window as he watched Sophie pack her small duffel bag. Her movements were slower now, more deliberate, unlike the frightened girl who had first arrived at his home. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, munching on toast and occasionally offering suggestions about what Sophie might need. Don't forget your drawing notebook, Hannah called out, her voice carrying a warmth that had been missing weeks ago. Mom always says memories are important. Sophie nodded, carefully tucking the notebook into her bag. I won't forget, she said quietly. Mom, she said I could bring whatever I wanted. David's heart squeezed at the way Sophie stumbled over what to call her mother. The past few weeks had changed so much between them all. Where there had once been tension and uncertainty, now there was understanding. Even Hannah had found her place in this unusual situation, becoming something of a big sister to Sophie. You know, David said, leaning against the counter, your mom's really trying. I saw it in her eyes yesterday when we talked. Sophie looked up, her fingers tracing the zipper of her bag. I know. She promised we'd have dinner together every night this week. Just us. That's wonderful, David replied, meaning it. The change in Catherine had been gradual but undeniable. The businesswoman who had once treated her daughter's care like a transaction had softened, finally seeing the emotional needs she'd overlooked for so long. Hannah got up from the table and walked over to Sophie, giving her an awkward but sincere hug. You better come visit. Dad's pancakes on Saturday mornings are actually pretty good. Hey now, David chuckled. What do you mean, pretty good? The sound of a car pulling up outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Catherine stepping out of her vehicle. This time, instead of her usual business attire, she wore casual clothes, jeans and a sweater. It was a small change, but it spoke volumes about her shifting priorities. She's here, Sophie whispered, but there was no fear in her voice now, just nervous anticipation. David picked up Sophie's bag. Ready? Sophie nodded, taking a deep breath. As they walked to the front door, David noticed how different her steps were. No more hesitation, no more dragging her feet. She had found her strength here, in this house that had become her temporary sanctuary. Catherine stood on the porch, her smile genuine if slightly uncertain. Good morning, she said, looking first at Sophie, then at David and Hannah. Thank you both for everything. Sophie moved toward her mother, and Catherine wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders. The gesture came naturally now, unlike the stiff embraces of before. We're going to stop for breakfast on the way home, Catherine said. Sophie's choice. The pancake place? Sophie asked hopefully, and Catherine nodded. David handed over the duffel bag, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. This was good, he reminded himself. This was how it should be. Don't forget, you're always welcome here, he said. Both of you, Hannah added, surprising everyone. As Catherine and Sophie walked to the car, Sophie turned back suddenly. She ran to David and hugged him tightly. Thank you, she whispered, then pulled away just as quickly. David and Hannah stood in the doorway, watching as Sophie climbed into the passenger seat. Through the car window she turned and waved, a genuine smile lighting up her face. It was the kind of smile that spoke of healing, of hope, of new beginnings. David sat at his kitchen table, turning the cream-colored envelope in his hands. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, warming his shoulders as he recognized Catherine's elegant handwriting. He hadn't heard from Sophie or her mother in 3 weeks, though Hannah had mentioned getting a few texts from Sophie. His fingers traced the edge of the envelope before carefully opening it. The paper inside was thick and expensive, matching Catherine's usual style. As he unfolded the letter, he noticed how her usually precise handwriting seemed slightly unsteady, more human somehow. "Dear David," he read silently, his eyes moving across the words. "I've started this letter a dozen times, trying to find the right words to express my gratitude." He paused, taking a deep breath. The house felt unusually quiet without Sophie's presence. Even Hannah had grown used to having her around, and her absence left a noticeable gap in their lives. "Dad?" Hannah's voice came from the doorway. She was still in her pajamas, her hair messy from sleep. "What's that?" "A letter from Catherine," he said, looking up at his daughter. "Want to hear it?" Hannah nodded, sliding into the chair across from him. She wrapped her hands around her favorite mug, the one with cartoon cats all over it, and waited. David cleared his throat and began reading aloud. "I've started this letter a dozen times, trying to find the right words to express my gratitude. The truth is, there aren't enough words to thank you for what you've done for Sophie. Not just for saving her life that day in the park, but for showing her what it means to be truly cared for." He paused, his voice catching slightly. Hannah leaned forward, her expression soft. "Sophie has changed so much in the weeks since she stayed with you," he continued reading. "She talks more now, she smiles more. Yesterday, she even suggested we take a short drive together, something I never thought would happen after the accident. When I asked her what made her feel brave enough, she said she remembered how you taught her that being scared was okay, but not letting fear control her life was even more important." Hannah smiled, remembering how her father had sat with Sophie during thunderstorms, teaching her breathing exercises he'd once taught Hannah. "I realize now," David read on, "that I was so focused on providing Sophie with material security that I forgot about her emotional needs. Watching her with you and Hannah showed me what I'd been missing. You gave her something I couldn't, a safe space to be vulnerable, to heal, to just be a child again." David's voice grew softer as he continued. "Sophie asks about you both every day. She keeps the drawing Hannah made for her on her bedside table, and she started writing in the journal you gave her. These might seem like small things, but to me, they represent the emotional tools she needed to start healing. Tools that you, David, helped her discover." He looked up at Hannah, who was wiping away a tear with the sleeve of her pajama top. "The letter goes on," David said, his own eyes growing misty. "She wants to know if Sophie can come visit us next weekend." "Really?" Hannah perked up, her face brightening. David nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. What had started as a simple act of heroism had transformed into something far more meaningful. He looked at his daughter across the table, remembering how she'd struggled at first with Sophie's presence, and how that struggle had ultimately brought them closer together. "Thank you, Hannah," he said softly. "For what?" "For opening your heart to Sophie, for being patient with me, for everything." Hannah sat cross-legged on her bed, flipping through her journal. The pages were filled with her thoughts from the past few weeks, messy scribbles about Sophie, her dad, and all the complicated feelings that had tangled up her heart. She paused at an entry from when Sophie first arrived, running her finger over the angry words she'd written. "I hate how Dad looks at her," she read aloud, cringing at her own jealousy. "It's like he forgot about me." But things were different now. The house felt emptier without Sophie. But somehow her heart felt fuller. Hannah closed the journal and hugged it to her chest, remembering how her father had run toward danger that day in the park. She'd been so scared watching him dash into the street, but now she understood something she hadn't before. That was just who her dad was, someone who helped others, even when it wasn't easy. From downstairs, she heard the familiar sound of her father working on the kitchen sink. The rhythmic clanking of his tools was comforting, like a heartbeat in their home. Hannah made her way down, pausing in the kitchen doorway to watch him work. "Need any help?" she asked. David poked his head out from under the sink, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Sure, kiddo. Hand me that wrench." As she passed him the tool, Hannah noticed the slight limp he still had from the accident. It made her throat tight thinking about how close she'd come to losing him that day. "Dad?" Her voice wavered slightly. "Remember when I got mad at you for spending so much time with Sophie?" David slid out from under the sink and sat up, giving her his full attention. "Yeah, I do." "I get it now," Hannah said, settling onto a kitchen chair. "Why you had to help her. It's like, it's who you are. The same way you've always been there for me." David's eyes softened. "Hannah, you know you'll always come first, right? Always." "I know," she nodded, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "But watching you with Sophie, it made me see how lucky I am. Some kids don't have anyone who cares that much." David reached over and squeezed her hand. "You taught me something too, you know. Watching you learn to share your home, your space, your dad." He smiled. "You've grown up so much." Hannah felt tears prick at her corners of her eyes. "I miss her sometimes. Sophie, I mean. Is that weird?" "Not weird at all," David assured her. He stood up, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "What do you say we take a break? Maybe make some of those cookies your mom used to make?" Hannah's face brightened. "The snickerdoodles?" "Those are the ones." As they gathered ingredients, moving around each other in their familiar kitchen dance, Hannah felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was what she'd been afraid of losing. These quiet moments with her dad, the comfortable silence, the way he knew exactly when she needed to talk, and when she just needed him near. They worked together, measuring flour and rolling dough balls in cinnamon sugar, the kitchen filled with the sweet, warm smell of baking cookies. And Hannah found herself telling her dad about school, her friends, all the little things she'd kept bottled up during the weeks Sophie was there. David listened, really listened, the way he always had. And Hannah realized that nothing had really changed between them at all. Their bond had only grown stronger. David sat on a wooden bench in the park, watching as Sophie approached with a bright smile on her face. The autumn breeze rustled through the leaves, and sunlight dappled the ground around them. It had been 3 weeks since Sophie had moved back in with Catherine, and the change in the young girl was remarkable. "Hi, David," Sophie called out, quickening her pace. She carried a small paper bag in her hands, decorated with colorful drawings. "Hey there, kiddo." David smiled warmly, making space for her on the bench. "What have you got there?" Sophie plopped down beside him and opened the bag. "I made cookies with Mom last night," she said, pulling out a container. "They're chocolate chip, your favorite." David's heart swelled at the mention of Catherine baking with Sophie. It was exactly the kind of mother-daughter activity he'd hoped they'd share. "That's wonderful. How was it, baking together?" "Mom burned the first batch," Sophie giggled, offering him a cookie. "But then we figured it out. She said she hasn't baked since she was a kid, but she wanted to try because—" Sophie paused, her voice growing softer. "Because I told her about how Hannah and you always baked together." David took a bite of the cookie, savoring both its sweetness and the moment. "These are really good. Your mom's learning, huh? Sophie nodded, her legs swinging beneath the bench. She's trying really hard now. Yesterday, she came home early from work to help me with my science project, and we're going to start having dinner together every night, even if she has to bring work home. That's fantastic, Sophie. David felt a surge of pride, not just for Sophie's progress, but for Catherine's efforts, too. I was scared at first, Sophie admitted, picking at the edge of her cookie. When I went back home, I thought everything would go back to how it was before. But it's different now. Mom talks to me more, and she actually listens when I tell her about my day. David watched as Sophie's face lit up while talking about these small but significant changes. Change takes time, he said gently. But it sounds like you're both working hard at it. Mom says she's learning too. She told me she never knew how to be there for me before, but now she wants to try. Sophie looked up at David, her eyes bright. And she said it was because of you. Because you showed her what it means to really care. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. Your mom's a smart woman, Sophie. Sometimes people just need a little reminder about what's really important. They shared a comfortable silence, munching on cookies and watching people pass by. A young father pushed his daughter on the swings nearby, their laughter carrying across the park. David, Sophie's voice was thoughtful. Even though things are better with Mom now, can I still come visit you and Hannah sometimes? Of course you can, David assured her, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. You're always welcome. Hannah would love that too. In the distance, they spotted Catherine approaching, her business suit replaced by casual weekend wear, another small but meaningful change. Sophie gathered her things, brushing cookie crumbs from her lap. Thanks for meeting me today, she said, wrapping her arms around David in a quick hug. David watched as Sophie walked toward her mother, noticing how Catherine's face softened into a genuine smile at her daughter's approach. The two of them fell into step together, Sophie chattering animatedly about something while Catherine listened intently. David adjusted the wrench in his tool belt as he climbed the steps to Mrs. Martinez's front porch. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered wood boards that needed fixing. His legs still ached sometimes, a reminder of that day in the park when he'd saved Sophie, but he barely noticed it anymore. Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Martinez called from inside. Come in, come in. The sink's been giving me trouble all week. As David stepped inside, he noticed someone else in the kitchen, a woman about his age with warm brown eyes and curly hair pulled back in a messy bun. She wore jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt, looking completely at home despite the chaos of tools spread across the counter. This is my friend Sarah, Mrs. Martinez said. She's been helping me repaint the living room. Sarah, this is David Brooks, the handyman I told you about. Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans and extended one to David. Nice to meet you. Elena's told me all about your work around the neighborhood. David felt an unexpected flutter in his chest as they shook hands. It had been years since he'd felt anything like that. All good things, I hope, he managed to say. Oh, the best, Sarah replied with a genuine smile, especially about what you did for that little girl in the park. That was incredibly brave. David ducked his head, focusing on opening his toolbox. Anyone would have done the same. No, Sarah said softly. They wouldn't have. As David worked on the sink, Sarah continued painting in the next room. They talked easily through the doorway about their work, their favorite local restaurants, and their shared love of old movies. Mrs. Martinez kept bringing them glasses of lemonade, beaming like she'd orchestrated the whole thing. Later, as David packed up his tools, Sarah appeared in the doorway. I'm actually doing some renovation work at the community center, she said. We could use someone with your skills if you're interested in volunteering. David hesitated. His schedule was already full with work and spending time with Hannah. but something about Sarah's earnest expression made him want to say yes. "I'd like that," he found himself saying. "Maybe we could grab coffee first and you could tell me more about the project?" The words came out before he could second-guess them. For a moment, panic gripped his chest, the same fear that had held him back for years, telling him he wasn't ready, that he didn't deserve to move forward. But then he thought of Sophie, who had taught him so much about healing and trust. He thought of Hannah, who had shown such strength in sharing her father's love with someone new. Maybe it was time for him to be brave in a different way. Sarah's face lit up. "I'd love that." As David drove home, he felt lighter somehow. The grief for his wife would always be there, but it no longer felt like a wall keeping him from living. He could honor her memory while still being open to new possibilities. He pulled into his driveway and saw Hannah sitting on the front steps, doing homework. She looked up and waved, and David felt a surge of gratitude for everything they'd been through together. "Hey, kiddo," he called out as he walked up. "How would you feel about having dinner at the new Italian place tonight?" Hannah's eyes widened in surprise. They rarely ate out these days. "Really? What's the occasion?" David sat down beside her, taking in the peaceful moment. "No occasion, just feeling thankful for new beginnings." The autumn breeze rustled through the leaves in David's backyard as he set the last plate on the outdoor table. The wooden picnic table, which he'd built himself years ago, was now adorned with a checkered tablecloth and simple wildflower centerpiece that Hannah had arranged. "Dad, they're here," Hannah called from inside the house. David's heart warmed at the sound of car doors closing and familiar voices approaching. The side gate creaked open, and Sophie burst through, her face lighting up at the sight of him. She was different now, standing taller, smile wider, eyes brighter. The scared little girl he'd saved from that truck seemed like a distant memory. "David!" Sophie ran up and wrapped her arms around his waist. At 12, she was getting too tall for this, but neither of them minded. "Hey, kiddo," he said, ruffling her hair. "How's school going?" "Much better," Sophie beamed. "I got an A on my art project. The one I told you about last week?" Catherine appeared behind her daughter, carrying a covered dish. She looked more relaxed these days, her previously stern expression softened by something that looked like contentment. "She wouldn't stop talking about that project all week," she said, offering David a genuine smile. "I hope you don't mind, but I brought that pasta salad you mentioned liking last time." "Of course not," David replied, taking the dish from her. "Hannah's been experimenting with cooking lately, so we might need backup." "I heard that." Hannah emerged from the house carrying glasses and lemonade. She gave Sophie a quick hug before setting everything down. The easy affection between the girls still amazed David. How far they'd come from those first tense days. They settled around the table, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. Sophie sat between Hannah and Catherine, chattering about school and her new art classes. Catherine listened intently, asking questions and sharing proud glances with David across the table. "Remember when you wouldn't even talk to us?" Hannah teased Sophie gently. Sophie rolled her eyes but smiled. "That feels like forever ago." "You've come so far," Catherine said softly, squeezing her daughter's hand. "We both have." David watched them interact, his chest tight with emotion. The weekly dinners had become their tradition over the past few months, a way to maintain their unexpected family bonds. He thought about how much had changed since that day in the park. Not just for Sophie, but for all of them. Hannah caught his eye and smiled knowingly. She'd grown too, becoming more understanding and compassionate. The jealousy that had once threatened to divide them had transformed into something beautiful, a shared capacity for love that made room for others without diminishing what they had. "David." Catherine's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Sophie has something she wants to show you. Sophie pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket, carefully smoothing it out on the table. It was a drawing, detailed and colorful, showing all four of them sitting at this very table, laughing together under a sunny sky. "It's for my art class," Sophie explained. "We had to draw what family means to us." David stared at the drawing, taking in the careful details. Hannah's curly hair, Catherine's gentle smile, his own protective stance, and Sophie in the middle, connecting them all. The simple truth of it, that they had become a family, different and stronger than any of them had imagined, hit him with unexpected force. Looking around at their smiling faces, at the love and healing that had grown from tragedy, David felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This wasn't the family any of them had planned for, but it was the one they'd built together, piece by piece, day by day, through pain and joy and everything in between. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story, and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.